All right. Welcome back to the Data Driven Strength Podcast. We are here with episode 3 of season number 2. A little bit of technical difficulties here getting started. We appreciate the patience of our very special guest today, Dr. Eric Helms. This is probably the third or fourth total time we've had a guest on the show at some point. And if I recall correctly, we've never properly introduced any guest we've had on the show. So with that, before we dive into today's discussion, which I don't really know what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about something related to recent research. But before we even get carried away with that, Dr. Helms, could you give yourself a brief introduction, who you are, to whatever extent that you see fit?
I was born in Oakland, California in 1983. And it would have been 4 years before I attended kindergarten. And I'll walk you through each month just to make sure it's comprehensive. No, on all seriousness, it's a huge pleasure and a privilege to be on. You guys are doing great work, and I'm really looking forward to discussing the really important contributions you guys have had to the data. As far as who I am, I'll start with where I am currently, and then we'll work back just a little bit. I am a senior research fellow at Auckland University of Technology, specifically in our lab, the Sports Performance Research Institute in New Zealand. And I'm essentially an applied sports scientist for strength and physique sport. So what led me here was being just a meathead myself. I fell in love with lifting, and it became a life philosophy and intellectual pursuit and a way of finding meaning 20 years ago and a few months now, believe it or not. That led me down my own personal pursuits as an athlete to eventually becoming a WNBF pro, which took an exorbitantly long amount of time compared to when I first set that goal 17 years ago. So I only turned pro last season. And it also helped me find my, brothers and colleagues in 3D Muscle Journey, where we do coaching and course creation and content to try to help people find a sustainable pathway to their own goals and falling in love with drug-free lifting. So I'm the chief science officer of 3DMJ, which started all the way back in 2010, kind of officially, where we are a home for all drug-free lifters, whether they're finding a way to express themselves through strength, hypertrophy, competitive or non-competitive. And I became kind of the resident nerd and followed that pathway more and more and more as my career progressed, moving from full-time coach, actually moving from personal trainer to full-time bodybuilding coach to part-time bodybuilding coach to authoring my books, The Muscle and Strength Pyramids, which I'm feverishly working away on the 3rd edition. Let's go. Pyramids up. And then started Mass, along with the original crew of Dr. Mike Zerdos and Greg Knuckles, who has recently stepped away, but wishing him the best with Stronger by Science and Macrofactor. And we have gained 2 more, Dr. Eric Trexler and, of course, Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. And we love nerding out on a monthly basis. And so that's basically me and what I do. And it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here, and an honor and other positive words to make you guys feel good on the inside, because you deserve it.
Love it.
Yeah,
we could just
yeah, let's cut that out. Anyway,
we can just keep buttering up Dr. Helms here. I think both of us have drawn inspiration or just appreciated your approach to science communication. And the way you go about things in general, and that's heavily, informed our approach. So that's why we, even though we don't have guests quite that often, this is now your second appearance on the podcast. So I think we had you on probably in like 2020, 2021, something like that. But we're glad to have you. And with some of the recent work that we've done, we've had some content on a little bit more of the technical side. And I think from here, it's going to be interesting to have some more, perhaps higher level discussions. And when I say higher level, I kind of mean less nitty gritty in terms of, hey, what was the exact methodology for, this analysis? What are some of the very nitty gritty limitations of the underlying data? That sort of thing. We wanted to get that stuff out there because it's important to acknowledge and to kind of be, especially given we're the authors of that work, to be the first to point that out, right? Because it's very important for interpretation. But I think from here, when you have more research, inevitably that just opens the door for a ton more questions, right? And I think discussions like this can hopefully push the field forward, or inspire further thought in the area. We've sent out other invitations for folks maybe with slightly different perspectives than the three of us as well. So we're looking forward to discussions on that front as well. And I think probably everything is fair game today in terms of what we'll discuss. But Eric, I know you've been obviously in the industry for considerably longer than us, and you alluded to working on the third edition of your books, right? Is that correct? Number 3? Sweet. So
That's right.
remind us when the first editions were published.
The first editions were published at the end of 2015, and I think they were available for purchase either right around there or early 2016.
Okay, cool. So 9 years later is when the third editions will come out, or thereabouts. So you don't
That's
have
right.
to spoil the plot too much, because I don't believe the third editions are out quite yet. But I believe you're in the process of writing them, or at least you're conceptualizing what's going to go into them. So I'm curious, if you were to compare your writings and therefore your thinking at the time of Volume in 2016 when those first editions were published, compared to where things are at now as you are working on the third editions, what's changed, if anything?
A tremendous amount. I think if you haven't been paying attention to the research for a long time, and especially if you weren't there as it was coming out, it can sometimes feel like not a lot's changed in sports science and our understanding hasn't changed. And sometimes I would say the directionality of that stuff hasn't changed, or big picture concepts haven't changed in terms of, oh yeah, I'll stick with that directionality. But I think the confidence, the certainty, and the specific detail to it has changed substantially. So I just got finished writing basically the data-driven strength chapter in my Muscle and Strength Pyramid third edition, because you guys just released 2 of the largest continuous analyses that are on the training dose, which is for strength and hypertrophy, it's volume and an RIR. Of course, load is for strength, a huge component of that, and frequency plays a role. But in the first editions, when I think about what was I informing those suggestions on, it was, what did we have at the time? And this was a paper by Wernbaum written in 2007 that was a systematic review with a semi-quantitative analysis, where it wasn't even doing any kind of weighting. It arguably was not a meta-analysis, although it did analyze a lot of studies, and it just reported basically average percentage changes associated with various resistance training variables for hypertrophy. So we're talking the number of reps and the percentage of 1RM ranges that were reported in these studies, and kind of just looking at that relationship in kind of these different categories. So it was relatively rudimentary. Plus, it was 15 years less of studies that were out at the time, right? And on the strength side, it was essentially a few different meta-analyses by Peterson, which had actually were 5 or 6 years old at that time, and looking at different relationships between various variables, not always, and probably looking back, the best methods to do so, and trying to come up with some type of synthesis for generalized recommendations. So the first edition, I was actually giving people percentage 1RM ranges and number of reps to do within those ranges. It's kind of like a proxy for what eventually we started to recognize was probably a better approach, is number of quote unquote hard sets, or sets within a given intensity quote unquote range. And that's what we saw and is one of the biggest changes to the training book when those came out in 2019, was I provided sets. And now that was based upon actually before the Bas-Val meta-analysis came out on volume. It was primarily based upon Ralston meta-analysis on strength, looking at weekly sets on a given pattern or movement pattern and the effect on 1RM, as well as the Schoenfeld meta-analysis on the number of sets that was this categorical and continuous analysis, but only ending up at 10 plus, because again, that meta-analysis is now more than 7 years old, and so much more research has come out. So the biggest change is just better data and continuous analysis and really useful moderator analyses, and me being a better communicator as to what does that mean in practice and what does the data not tell us, I think is something that I'm really emphasizing a lot in this edition.
Yeah, it's wild to think how much has changed. Like in the moment, it can feel like
Snail's pace.
Yeah, it can feel like a snail's pace, and you always kind of get especially once something has been a little bit more solidified, and I use that word loosely. You're like, oh, that kind of seems obvious with the benefit of hindsight, but in actuality, I remember growing up, I had a baseball coach who also kind of operated as our strength and conditioning coach as well.
The best combo.
Yes, and I remember him just really focused on the fact that if you train a muscle while it's still sore, you're going to lose muscle. And, just all the different things you hear. And now it seems obvious that something like that isn't true. But back then that seemed pretty convincing, at least to me when I was 15 years old, with the, this authority figure in my life. So it's wild to see how much has changed. And we're very much looking forward to the royalty checks that will be coming in. And we'll just continue to upgrade the podcast studio as a result of that. So thank you to the Pyramids, thank you to Eric Helms, and we'll see you in episode 4.
You're very welcome. Happy to support.
Well, sweet. So I presume you've read the paper. Is that safe to say? Our recent pre-printed meta-regressions.
Just the abstract, actually.
Just the abstract. Sweet.
Definitely read the paper. I've gone through all the supplementary files, you name it.
Awesome. So
that's a bold warrior.
And
right
I mostly want to talk about the
bold
decision
warrior.
to use. I think we need to specifically talk about the decision to use the cubic spline model. I want to say that is probably where I think most of this podcast should be directed. I don't know about you guys, but I think that'd be most interesting to the listener.
Yeah, I think we can do another 3 or 4 hours of methods. I think that would be really riveting. What was the average?
Sweet.
What was the average duration?
I actually looked at it and it was longer than what I expected. I can't remember what it was.
So we're referring
5-hour episode.
We're referring to the 5-hour episode. The average view duration. I think it was probably
it was 4.5 hours if I had to guess.
Yeah. I think the average person sat down and just. I'm not going to use that term. Okay. So anyway. You gave it a read. Thank you very much. You are obviously familiar with the volume research in general, right? I'm sure you've read most, if not all, the studies. What comes to mind on your end in terms of a big limitation, or maybe even if you can think of it off the top of your head, potentially the biggest limitation of either our project, because there are many limitations, to the specific approach that we took, or alternatively, maybe just the volume research in general, right? What do you think are some potential limitations that influence practical application? Does anything come to mind for you, Dr. Helms?
Oh yeah, there's a big one that anyone with even half a brain is aware that it invalidates all the volume research, and that's the fact that it's very clearly just an effect of swelling. I think it's hard to deny.
We're only 20 minutes in, and he's already... All right.
Listen, it's hard to deny that it isn't just swelling. I don't have any evidence to actually support that. And I haven't thought through that enough because it would require me to question my own biases. But it feels right. And therefore, I'm pretty sure you guys have just told us how much does muscles swell in response to increasing sets, which maybe is great for like your pump up before you get on stage, but is pretty much useless and a huge waste of resources. And how dare you conduct this meta-analysis?
Hey, I'm you're being sarcastic, and I'm trying to decide which approach to take here, because someone as a well-respected...
Josh, can I stop you?
Yeah, please.
I'm going to do it for you. I'm going to do it for you because you guys shouldn't.
I want to tip my cap. I want to tip my cap to all perspectives. That's kind of the approach that we decided on the front end. Is it's a little bit different, I guess, just to be transparent here with discussions Zach and I have had. Is it's a little different when we are on this podcast or whatever the case may be discussing someone else's work, because kind of arguably your job is to be critical, right? And also critical to other critiques about just the discussion in general around something. But when you're the one doing the work, you want to be as what's the word I'm looking for?
Charitable.
Yeah, as charitable as possible to all perspectives. And as a result, we want to leave the door open to potentially just a massive blind spot such as swelling. And maybe that is the case. I think that might deserve its own episode at some point.
Stop it! I'm taking over. I'm taking the mic.
All right,
you stop. Stop it, Josh. Okay, stop it. Listen, here's the deal. You guys are amazing, and I'm not going to act like this is going on the NASA podcast and going, you know what? You're right. The moon landing didn't happen. Let's give this some fair acknowledgement. It's not that ridiculous of a position statement, and it is very good that you guys are seriously answering the question. But I think this has gone far enough, because it does not take that much critical thinking to assess that this is probably not the case. And I will say it for you guys. Yes, it's worth asking the question, but I would say we're at a point, if this is a courtroom drama, where it's asked and answered. That's not it, right? And why am I so confident in that? And I can explain this very simply and logically. If higher volumes precipitously resulted in increasing amounts of swelling, we would see less heterogeneity and more certainty with higher volumes producing a positive effect for hypertrophy. And that's not what we see. There is less certainty in your model as you guys go. Now, granted, there's a whole lot less studies on very, very high volumes, but this should be a relatively homogeneous effect that just simply increases as you go with volumes. And there's plenty of studies in the moderate volume ranges. And we do not see a narrowing of the effect to where everyone grows better from higher volumes. And if you look at individual participant data, we can look at like the DeMoss one, where they've got the higher frequency, 15 sets versus the moderate frequency, lower sets. We can look at various studies. You can look at any study that we've all done and we've been a part of, where we've seen the individual participant data, and there is not a narrowing of effect to where we stop seeing negative responses to higher volumes. If it was true that there was this progressive increase in swelling and it lasted for longer than the time period we had between the last training session and the actual ultrasound or MRI, whatever technique we're talking about, depending upon the specific study, we would be seeing universally higher responses in hypertrophy. And that's not what's being observed. And I really have a tough time understanding this perspective, because to me, it is so very obviously being applied in a, I would say, poorly weighted way. Because when you guys did the RIR meta-regression, and we have plenty of data actually showing that there's higher indirect markers for muscle damage after training to failure, no one said, hold on, how do we know that this effect of getting closer and closer to failure isn't just a swelling outcome? And you could actually cite far more papers to show that and have a leg to stand on than you could for volume. And importantly, I'm not saying that I don't think there's more swelling with more volume. I think there probably is. In fact, how could there not be if there's more swelling with more training to failure? Because most of the studies on higher volumes are training to failure. So you're just doing more training to failure, right? However, if it was a systematic thing that people could not adapt to, the repeated bout effect did not impact it, it didn't matter if we waited 72, 96, or 48 hours, we would start to see some very consistent trends in the data where we'd stop seeing low responders or non-responders with higher volumes, and higher volume groups would more consistently be shown to be better. And that's not what we're seeing. So I appreciate your guys' very weighted position in responding to this and going, you know what, we need to be the most critical of our own paper. And you guys addressed it at length in one of your podcasts, and so if anyone wants to dig into the 7 hours of content you guys already have on this, and that's not an exaggeration or a joke, because there is 2 podcasts, they actually do add up to that amount. You put them together,
and we're halfway
through. You guys
through.
addressed this in depth. That's right. So I think this is one of those things. It's like, good question, reasonable thing to look at, and there are 2 other points. So one, if this is a critique you want to level at volume research, level it at all research. And if you think that 48, 72, or even 96 hours is insufficient for us to measure the actual true change, even when we have group-based models, sufficient sample sizes, then stop looking at any training studies to inform anything, because that's how they're all done. And I would also point out that in Dr. Refalo now, his work, we actually did a comparison between waiting 6 days versus waiting 2 days, and we saw almost a perfect correlation in the two analyses. So that's basically saying that if this is sticking around, because we had a relatively high volume
relatively high
two failure
volumes.
protocol, in one of the legs, and pretty well trained people, which is what we care about. At least most of the people who are bringing up this quote unquote issue. Then, if it's still hanging around that long after, then you know what? We should just pack it up and just do nutrition research, because the swelling is so much of a confounder that you can wait almost a full week after training and it is still preventing us from making any conclusions.
Yeah, I think, Zach, I think perhaps a fruitful discussion here would be us to steelman the position and see if we can't go from there. So, Zach, does anything come to mind for you regarding steelmanning that position?
I think the biggest thing that makes this challenging is people don't really formalize what they're saying. Like that's the biggest challenge with this to me, is like, I think about it like mathematically in terms of, okay, you're saying swelling is occurring, and that is occurring to a greater extent with higher volumes. Let's think about how that would actually result in the outcomes that we're looking at. And this is, of course, we can't have visuals for this podcast, unfortunately, listener, I'm sorry. But in one of the graphs in the slideshow I shared you guys is, and we have one of these on Instagram, I believe. Josh, you made a post, kind of a follow-up post on the meta. And it's essentially just looking at different functional forms, kind of like we looked at in the meta regression, of how this stimulus and swelling relationship could come about. So if you assume that there is no swelling that is occurring from training that's biasing our measurements, then the stimulus curve that we're trying to approximate is going to perfectly reflect what we actually observe in our measurements, right? That's kind of that's step one. Step two is we could have a couple different ways that this swelling could be impacting our measurements. One of them could be just like a very basic linear relationship, and I think that's the one that you posted about on Instagram. And so essentially what that's just going to say is that there's going to be incrementally greater swelling because it's just a linear additive effect for every set that you do. Now, the issue I have with that is that pretty much everything in physiology has diminishing returns associated with it, and these like asymptotic effects. A linear effect of swelling just doesn't even make sense to me. Like, there's probably only so much that a muscle tissue can handle in terms of a swelling induced growth acutely. Like, I just have a hard time believing that's going to go up and up and up and up for every single set that you do. It's probably some sort of logarithmic diminishing returns relationship, just like we see with anything else, in which is going to have less of an effect on the actual measurements that we're observing anyway. So for me, when I think about what is a steelman, conceptually rigorous, in my opinion, way that this could play out, is that, yes, I do think on average there's probably slightly greater swelling with higher volumes, but I don't think it makes sense that it's a linear effect such that the effect of swelling is massive. And similar to what Eric has said, I think I do somewhat take issue with that principle not being applied across training variables. Like that's my biggest thing with this, is like, I completely understand that is something somebody would want to have relatively conclusive evidence to rule out. And I think Eric made a pretty strong case why, for the most part, it shouldn't be a massive concern. And I honestly think Martin's data is really, really encouraging for this, honestly, because I was part of that project as well. And the training was very, very challenging. There's videos posted. The
well-trained people grew a good amount.
Well-trained guys and gals are growing a good amount. There is RAR verification in those videos that people are not going to, bust chops at. And it was relatively high volumes. That was individualized per the individual training. So, and it was relatively, decent amount of training time. And the volumes increased halfway throughout the intervention as well. So like all these things that you would theoretically expect to influence those measurements, like Eric said, it was nearly a perfect correlation between the post-test measurements that is a good applied example where we need to apply this criticism equally across training variables, but because that's an RAR study, quote unquote, it's not used in this discussion. And so that does bother me a little bit. The load variable for hypertrophy, I think another one is gets shoved underneath the bus, is like everyone kind of makes the claim that higher reps are more fatiguing with a lot of the measurements that we utilize. So in theory, 3 sets of 30% of 1RM versus 3 sets of 80% of 1RM, you would expect the swelling to be much greater with the lower loads, and that would bias this entire fundamental concept of hypertrophy, such that sets with low loads and high loads to failure are going to lead to relatively equivalent outcomes so long as set volume is equivalent. So I think it's just like that bothers me a little bit in terms of steel manning the position, but that's another tangent I'll try to stay off of. But hopefully the kind of the diminishing returns relationship aspect of swelling to me is like when you really sit down, and I think most people would agree with that if they're, really thinking deeply about it, as opposed to just making the kind of throwaway comment that this is swelling. Like, okay, that is a totally reasonable thought. And I still think we don't have the conclusive evidence that a study that is specifically designed for that question, higher volumes, all this, et cetera, that is going to provide, a counterclaim to that directly. You would have to use some of these, other sorts of lines of thinking that, again, Eric made a pretty strong and compelling case to kind of say that. But I think if you do that and you kind of think about this in a very rigorous manner, I have a hard time conceptualizing that it's going to completely bias the results to the extent that they're not usable. Like that, I struggle with that to even when trying to steel man, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. Obviously, we tend to hold pretty similar positions on these sorts of things. Where I am still, I guess, just to put my cards on the table, I'm quite sympathetic beyond just this approach of being very charitable and acknowledging all perspectives. I'm honestly quite sympathetic to it, less because I think that the effects of swelling are explaining the entire relationship, but even if it has some effect, when you layer on some of the other limitations of our analysis, I think that could lead to a pretty different dose-response relationship if we, waved a wand and we had, hundreds of studies with non-training control groups, and we had a group doing 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 plus sets per week. If we had all of that, I tend to believe that, if anything, the diminishing returns would be stronger.
And not to cut you off, that was the last thing I was going to say. And I still maintain that. Like,
Yeah.
even a very well-constructed kind of critique of the swelling stuff, I still think leads you to that conclusion. And we said that multiple times. So
Yeah.
I felt that's kind of the main thing we put our cards on the table, is that, yes, I think swelling could have a conceivable effect. And if anything, it's going to make the diminishing returns a little bit more aggressive. But I think that was well stated in kind of our overall position. And I don't think that invalidates the data for use at all.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think we're all kind of, I think we're largely on the same page. Maybe just I'm coming at it from a different angle than you guys, and we're kind of converging on the same point nonetheless, is that we're all open to this explaining some degree of the effects, layer in some of the other limitations of dose response modeling in our field. Again, see that 5-hour podcast if you're interested in the nitty gritty there. I think, if anything, again, the diminishing returns are understated. So in other words, we think the diminishing returns would probably be stronger if we had the perfect data set in the world. We think we have a really good data set in the world, but it's probably not a perfect data set. Eric, I guess I'll pause there and see if you want to add anything. If not, I can steer the ship here a little bit, because I think there's some interesting follow-ups on this.
I do have a bit to add, and we can actually discuss what I think are probably more relevant limitations to your guys' work from that. Because I think what you're saying of, hey, these diminishing returns are probably, if anything, understated by our analysis, is not directly related to the swelling question. Yep. They might have similar results, but it's almost a means to an end. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people look at this and they are fearful, and I'll include myself in this, that people are going to interpret this as, okay, I should be doing, 42 sets, because that's going to get me the best response, without any kind of caveat or understanding of what those diminishing returns truly mean, or we're thinking about what the data doesn't tell us. And I think because we're aware of the real world outcomes of when someone tries to do such volumes, and you're aware that there are aspects of the data and the nature of this research that are going to, if anything, understate the diminishing returns, there's efforts to try to go, hold on. Don't run wild with this volume. And I understand that, and I actually like that as a philosophy, but I don't think that this should be thrown against the wall to see what sticks along with it, because there's a cost to thinking that swelling is a confounder and that we have to wait longer for all this stuff. It's a methodology issue that's not a real issue, in my opinion, and that can actually lead people astray and have them lose confidence in some of the sports science research. Well, and there's plenty of reasons to lose confidence in sports science research. It's not perfect, but this is not one of them. So it's kind of one of those, like, let's not just have this generalized throwaway statement. Let's have the real discussion as to why we probably shouldn't be doing, 42 sets, because there's a big difference between understanding a relationship in a lab setting between two variables and what you should do in the gym on Tuesday. And I think that is where, like, if I wasn't being facetious and I didn't send us down this swelling rabbit hole, which, by the way, swelling rabbit holes, it's very hard for rabbits to fit in them. They're very tight fits. You have to wait more days for the rabbit to be able to get out. That's an interesting aspect of rabbit hole research. I think what we need to be talking about instead is, okay, so what are the limitations of this? Why shouldn't I be doing 42 sets? And one of the great things you guys did was you looked at other statistical ways of analyzing this. You said, hey, look at the pairwise comparisons. After 30 sets, the uncertainty is so high that we can't state under typical statistical methods or ways of interpreting or inferring things about the data that we have a sufficient confidence that there'll be a greater effect. So in my books, I'm basically describing there is a functional plateau due to uncertainty in the beneficial effects of higher volumes at 30 sets. So I'm actively participating in that. Let's tamp down our confidence in these effects. And I also have a section called an inverted U. And I basically say that while the data does not support an inverted U, there must be an inverted U. And I start to explain why. And I think some of the really important limitations are not related to what the data tell us, but what the data cannot tell us. And we don't know. The data does not tell us that 30 sets provides the highest hypertrophy for all muscle groups and a well-balanced hypertrophy program that is completely ecologically valid, nor does it tell us that everyone will respond to 30 sets in the same way in all circumstances, in various different conditions and environments, nor does it tell us that you should train with 30 sets in perpetuity to max out your gains long term. What it does tell us is that if you focus on a handful of muscle groups at most, and someone asked you, how do you get as big as possible in the next 10 and a half weeks on average? What should you do? And you go, I do as many freaking sets as I can basically fit, maybe stopping around 30. And hopefully, if I don't drop out from elbow tendonitis or just not having the time commitment to be able to do this all, that's probably going to give me the largest increase in muscle thickness, volume, or cross-sectional area in that time span. And I think any good coach should understand that that's not the same thing as what should I write in my program. And instead taking a constraints-led approach and thinking about the individual first, and then just knowing that there is this diminishing returns relationship is what actually informs the programming decision. So I spend a lot of time emphasizing those things and trying to help people understand what is it we're actually measuring, what is it we're not measuring, and what do our conclusions really tell us. Because I think even applied sports science, like we're talking about here, is really primarily there just to tell us about relationships between variables. And then we understand those concepts, we understand those relationships, and we can make different decisions based upon when there's an actual problem to be solved. And it could be the initial problem of, hey, coach, how should I set up my program to grow? And we go, okay, well, how much time do you have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? What have you done previously? What are you adapted to? What do you like? What do you have access to? How long's your commute? Blah, 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 all that stuff. What's the proximity of your goal? And then okay, great. Here's what we should do. And then after that, we've hit a plateau. You're stuck. This isn't working, or you're really just burning out on this, etc. What do we do about that? We now know, okay, maybe that inverted U isn't so obvious that you go over 20 sets like we could have speculated, that you're actually going to get smaller or regress or grow at a slower rate. But we do know that the diminishing returns could be so much that you're not really getting much out of it. But what are other costs not captured by these studies that could be occurring from attempting to do that level of volume? And is it worth it? Because there's many things that studies don't measure. And when we get a little too lost in quantitative land, worst theme park ever, by the way, we can sometimes think like, look, if it's not measured, it doesn't exist. But there are many things that do exist that we just haven't measured that we can't report on. And I just think about the experience of running training studies. You see things, but if you don't have a way of measuring it repeatably, reliably in all of your participants, it's just essentially an anecdote that you noticed while training. But it very well could be quantified. You create a psychometric scale for it, you report it, and it's difficult. Like, how many dropouts do you think you're going to get in an 8 or 12 week period? And if you only get a total of 3 out of 20 people, there's no way to statistically say that, we had 2 in one group and 1 in the other, so we had twice the dropout rate, and it was definitely a real thing. Like, no, it's 3 people dropped out. There's 2 groups. It's going to be 2 in one and 1 in the other, no matter what. So all of these things that we can't know with any type of true mathematical or statistical certainty about the research we do is something that researchers are aware of, but it's hard to even put in our discussions based upon what is, I would say, culturally acceptable in scientific writing. So I think they need to be discussed on podcasts. They need to be discussed by science communicators. And when I write a more practical book that's not a pure textbook like the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, that's something that I'm really, really emphasizing. And I think you guys have done a very good job of discussing the limitations of your data. And also with the RIR meta-analysis and this volume meta-analysis, talking about like, hey, we understand the relationship, but it's when all else is equal, it's controlling for all these other variables. And it is quite challenging to say what's going to happen when you then integrate this back in with all the other variables we're potentially manipulating. I'll give one last example and then I'll shut up. One of the things that I tried to really contextualize for the reader is the counting method, the fractional set counting method. And I said, hey, this fits what we observe in the real world best compared to the direct or indirect, right? But it's really important to understand that a bench press is not literally half as effective as a tricep push down for triceps growth, right? An overhead press is not literally half as effective at improving your bench press 1RM as a bench press. And then I go through all the various contextual factors that are going to explain on an individual basis in a different context where it completely changed those relationships. But if we're looking at 2,000 people, on average, yes, one set of overhead press is going to transfer about half as effectively as a bench press to a bench press-ish. But that is just a way of us counting and talking about things broadly. It is not a reality. And it's kind of that whole, classic saying that has been around for a couple of years now. All models are wrong, but some models are useful. And useful is always dependent upon a context. And I think a lot of people, sometimes they take what might be useful for discussing generalizable principles of programming to actually, how should I view this when I go to the gym on Tuesday? And it's like, oh, well, I don't want to do overhead press if I'm going to max out on Saturday because I'd be better at benching today. Well, maybe, but that's not actually what we know from that. We're talking about these things in at a much higher level, with much less zooming in on the exact topic or the specific person or the specific circumstance. So I think that is the type of discussion that really needs to be robust. And unfortunately, talking about that in a way that is understandable by everyone and applicable is challenging to do because it is lost in some of the nuance of these relatively complex topics. But I think, we're doing a good job of that now, I hope.
Yeah, I hope this contributes in that direction because, to your point, that is something I'm mindful of with communicating this dose response specifically, because I've had personal experiences where, in hindsight, I shouldn't have tried that training approach because I paid the price for it and it not only impacted it not only negatively impacted me in the short term in terms of being able to sustain a training program, but also kind of lingered for a while. And I think we've seen other anecdotes of that as well. And you also mentioned like specific research experience. This is another reason why it makes me a little bit hesitant, right? Zach, you can probably talk to this better than I can, because for your master's thesis, we did a study in the squat and the bench press comparing. It was 4 to 6 RP versus 7 to 9 RP versus training to failure.
And all the way to failure.
Yeah, so there were effectively 4 conditions. And the reason there were 4 conditions is because originally there were going to be 3 conditions. And one of those conditions was every single set to failure.
Yep.
But we quickly learned that that was not feasible, right? And it wasn't that high of volumes. If I recall correctly, it was 3 or 4 sets 3 times per week for each squat and bench press, with a little bit of accessories, but not all that much. And yeah, the like training to failure 3 times a week on squat and bench press just absolutely was not feasible, and I would not recommend that. And I think it's to your point, Eric, those are likely the things that are going to limit folks in terms of determining the volume cap. At least that's kind of how I've shifted recently, is instead of saying Zach's optimal bicep volume is 12 sets a week and mine is 6 sets a week and Eric's yours is 22. It's less about that, and it's probably going to be more so working backwards from what's realistic based on some of those logistical constraints. And again, I've just seen the negative consequences of trying to push too hard effectively, right? And I think once you've been training for 5-10 years, you become more level-headed, and you probably look at this data, as we all are, with what I would think a pretty balanced view and therefore a balanced practical application. But again, I'm very hesitant with these things, and I'm almost trying to overemphasize the limitations, especially at the upper end of the dose response relationship, because I don't want to further some of those. I don't want to increase the number of those negative events happening for folks. What do you think, Zach?
Yeah, no, I generally agree. I think it's tough because I think at the end of the day, we communicate science because we want people to gain practical utility from it. So it's always that balance of heeding caution, but also being directive. And this is just the game you play with science communication. That's always just so hard. And the striking the balance of it is heeding caution, but not being so hand wavy and nuanced that people can't actually get the directive that you're actually trying to provide them with. But no, I generally agree with the way that Eric kind of put it too, in terms of, at the end of the day, like the primary thing I view these really big projects is just providing us, from a practical perspective, the directionality of these effects, so that you can use that as kind of your mental framework for troubleshooting on the individual level, that has so many different considerations that you're not going to face in these studies due to a variety of different factors. One that we've hammered on the high volume stuff is like the slight selection bias kind of thing that can occur in terms of only including people who can actually sustain the studies, right? So there's just so many different things that influence it actually on the ground. But I think, those framework principles that I think that we can derive from these kind of things are really helpful from that end. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, well said. I think from here, yeah, go for it.
I just want to provide maybe one helpful perspective shift I've had based upon your guys' data as a lifter for the listener, so they can kind of see, maybe how should I take this, or what's really changed. Previously I was pretty convinced, and I still am, that there is an inverted U relationship. Didn't know where it was, but that there was actually kind of this effect of you're outpacing your ability to recover from training to the point where you're slowing down the actual rate of adaptation, so that I could go from doing 15 sets to 25, and my rate of growth would actually be slower. And I think now, and that it would almost be like this insidious thing I wouldn't know. Yeah. Like I could be getting better gains at 15 sets, but I'm getting gains at 25 sets, and I'm working really hard. So how do I know that the grass isn't greener actually on the other side of the fence I just hopped over? I got to go backwards, right? Now I'm much more of the opinion that, if you can get through the program, complete it, and maintain all the other variables. That, the volume isn't detracting from your RIR, the volume isn't detracting from your form, the volume isn't detracting from your ability to sleep or adhere to the program. That's how the inverted U occurs.
100%.
Is that the side effects of trying to do the volume. So now, instead of it being this insidious thing I'm afraid of, I feel like, okay, if I increase the volume and it's working against me, as you guys so aptly put it, I'll be acutely aware of that.
Yep.
Like, I am getting hurt. I cannot do this. I am limping around at night. My elbow tendonitis is preventing me from holding the bar on RDLs. All those types of things. Like, I think it just knowing that you will be aware of the issue, that it's not going to be something that sneaks up on you, that you're not like this secret victim of high volume, negative effects, I think is quite comforting.
Yeah, it's
and
empowering.
It should give, exactly, it's empowering. It should give athletes and coaches the knowledge of, all right, hey, look, we can try this out. And if you're able to recover, but if your performance all of a sudden gets like really variable, your sleep gets messed up, you're getting tendonitis, you're feeling senses of burnout, you're dreading your workouts, and when you send me the videos, you think you're at RPE 10, but it actually looks like you're an RPE 8 to me. All right, this is probably not worth it. Our increase in quantity is actually degrading quality more than I think it'll benefit us, or that we're potentially on the way to something causing a larger issue than any potential benefit we're getting. And that's, I think, a really important mentality shift that I am personally, like seeing as a bodybuilder.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I think what you just said explains how our data can explain multiple different anecdotes. So the knee-jerk reaction for someone that kind of is in a quote-unquote low-volume camp is that, how is this possible? I've tried high volumes. It hasn't worked well for me. I've seen great results training with 5 sets per muscle group per week. I think that is very much still compatible with our data for the reasons you mentioned, right? Again, the average participant in the included studies is probably, I think it was like 25 years old. So that's slightly above college age, but nonetheless, most of the participants were probably college age, probably have a little bit less on their plate than maybe the average person looking to apply these findings. And like you said, Eric, I've been really enjoying that perspective on research studies, is that, hey, you have 12 weeks to get as much muscle growth as possible, go, right? That's a much different question than, hey, you have a 10, 20, 30 plus year training career, make as much progress as possible. And hey, there's a lot of other benefits that come from lifting beyond just strength and hypertrophy. Go. Those are totally different. Those are totally different questions. And I think hopefully podcasts like this, again, allow us to kind of separate, hey, this is our best estimate with the tools we have, with the data we have of the physiological dose-response relationship. That is quite a different question, or that is quite a different question of what do I do long-term in practice. I think a missing piece here for some folks is the question of, okay, this is the dose-response relationship we see on average, but does this apply to me, right? Going back to someone that might fall in the low-volume camp, maybe that person just does best with lower volumes. And I think something that the three of us are kind of keyed in on is Zach's dissertation, because we're all aware of that project. And I guess I'll just mention to that here that there is more to discuss. But Zach, what do you want to say on that, if anything?
I mean, I think ultimately, I just think the environmental constraints that people operate within are just, in the impacts of those, I think are often strongly underestimated in the power that they have, I guess is the way that I would view it. Is like, I tend to believe the anecdotes that people are giving me. I take those seriously, particularly from extremely experienced lifters that seem to say they are like this low volume person that does considerably better with those approaches. I just think that why that is the case probably has an entire another 5-hour podcast to unwrap that. But I think arriving on that conclusion from a practical perspective is totally reasonable. It's just the reasons why you may be arriving there may be a little bit more nuanced than one may expect, I guess, is the short version of that.
Yeah, I'm really excited for your data to get out there, because I think your RAR dose response modeling, this project that we're talking about right now, as well as your dissertation, kind of create like a really nice, like kind of work together to ultimately lead to a lot of the conclusions that you just mentioned, Eric, and I think we're largely on board with. So more to come on that front, but like I said, I think the main point we're circling around here is that our data is very much compatible with you being a low volume person, right? And just adopting that, and that very well being better for you in the long run. I'm one of those people, right? I've mentioned that a few times, but I just don't do well with quite high volumes for one reason or another. And but that doesn't mean I think that our dose response relationship is completely backwards.
I think that's a good example. Just like to talk through practically, it's like you may be operating on a lower part of the dose response curve on average, but likely if you were able to tolerate a higher training volume, that would probably still lead to at least an expectation that lead to a better response in a given period of time, and all the constraints associated with
it primarily comes from tolerance, and it primarily comes from not wanting to resent training when days are busy and you have to fit in a 2.5 hour training session, right? Those are kind of the main ones, but nonetheless, I think something you mentioned, Eric, that is an interesting thread to pull on is, okay, if I go from, I think your example is 15 sets to 25 sets, and perhaps asking yourself the question of maybe that wasn't worth it, and maybe 15 sets was actually better. A common narrative or a common suggestion is that you should look at progress to make that determination, or you should say, hey, is progressive overload occurring, and how does that progressive overload, or how does that progress compare now at my current volumes compared to if I were to go up or down in terms of my training volume? Ultimately, we looked at that to some degree, right, with the strength data. And this is something I've always I've wrestled with in my head the last couple of years specifically, is, hey, you should make sure you're always recovering from the given volume that you're doing. And if you're not, therefore, you're not going to benefit from it. Now, I think we need to define exactly what recovery is, because if it's not tolerating the current dosage, then that's obviously an issue, because you're not going to be able to sustain it. Now your long-term dosage or your long-term volume is going to be lower. But I think a lot of people conflate recovery with maximizing progress. If I were to try to maximize my progress in the next 6 weeks, I'd probably do pretty dang low volumes in terms of trying to express strength maximally. And I'm curious, Eric, if you've gotten to that point in the third editions where you kind of get to the practical recommendations, if any, regarding assessing hypertrophy or assessing what's going to work best for the reader, for the individual. But before we kick it to you, I'm
going to restate real quick, just because I want to make it crystal clear to make sure I'm understanding and make sure Eric's understanding. You're essentially offering the discussion point that it's often claimed that essentially volume load progression, or your sets and reps at a fixed RAR, or your load and your reps at a fixed RAR, is essentially the best proxy that we have of muscle growth. Muscle growth is very hard to measure in practice. You can try triangulating that with body mass and skinfold measurements or circumferences, things like that. But at the end of the day, most people are probably suggesting that performance is kind of our best indicator of that.
Yep.
And so the practical question there is, there's kind of two ways you can view that. It's keeping a pulse on that and kind of viewing it in a binary, let's say, is something we've discussed a few times. Am I making progress or am I regressing? Kind of in a binary like that. The second way, which is the kind of the claim that's mentioned, is the approach that's going to maximize my volume load progression, or even just looking at
just strength in general,
standalone performance on an exercise, let's say. That is the approach that also maximizes hypertrophy. That's the claim that kind of is out there that you guys kind of want to dig into. I just wanted to rephrase, because I think that's really, really important to get crystal clear in terms of the implications there.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think this is one of those ones where you really do have to extrapolate outside of the data, because the same issues we have with the short-term nature of hypertrophy research is the same issue we have with the short-term nature of strength research. We have slightly longer studies because it's easier to keep people around. And if you've got the equipment to do a training study, you've got the equipment to test strength, but you don't necessarily have an ultrasound or an MRI. And that's why you guys have twice as many participants in your analysis of strength and hypertrophy, right? It's like 2,000-ish versus 1,000.
Yep.
But I think I always find myself in an interesting position here where I have to fill in gaps with theory and practice knowledge here because of the disconnects between the real world and what the data can tell us. I'm not even necessarily comfortable framing it the way you guys did, because I think there's a little more of a black box of what's going on. I wouldn't say that the change in strength is related to the change in hypertrophy over the time course that we typically measure it in training studies. In fact, we know it's not. They don't share that strong of a relationship if we just look at a pre-post measure like that. I also wouldn't say that in the time courses we study, if you look at just the progression in a training program, we look at like the volume load changes, is related or predictive of the rate of hypertrophy over that time course. But then I also know that when we look at data on strength athletes across the board, we see that acute measurements of hypertrophy explain the highest amount of variance of their performance and discriminate between higher and lower performers in, say, powerlifting. It's been shown like 4 or 5 times. And we've even got some studies that have recently come out showing that the change in certain hypertrophy metrics predicts the change in a 1RM in competition. There's a Tremaris paper that came out that was 12 weeks long looking at this in powerlifters, which is pretty interesting. And we also have data which really make it difficult to think of a world where hypertrophy isn't influencing strength. I've tried to go that old steel manning process we did earlier on this one to check myself on this. And where I really come down to going, okay, I have a tough time thinking that hypertrophy doesn't influence strength is when we take training out of the equation. When you see that doses of testosterone result in proportionally higher increases in strength, like the Bayesian studies, or we see myostatin inhibition in animal models resulting in increases in strength, or we see stretching when the absence of training improves isometric force or dynamic force production for that given muscle when you test it, like in some of the boot stretching stuff that Warnicki has done, and then testing calf strength or isometric strength. So I am a pretty strong believer that not only is strength, related to hypertrophy, but that at a certain point in your expertise with a given movement, or if you remove expertise from the equation and you're a more advanced quote unquote lifter, it probably explains the majority of your strength. We've actually got a few studies now when we look at like isometric relationships. And if you just pull anybody out of a crowd, the thing that's going to probably predict their isometric quadriceps strength is going to be their quadriceps cross-sectional area or volume. And we compare an untrained person to a trained person, and we even do some assessments of our best guess at how do we measure, say, like voluntary contraction ability, or quote unquote their ability to neuromuscularly produce force. That explains far less of the variance than morphological factors. So how do I hold that to be true and also say that I don't think the proportional change in progressive overload or the pre-post change in a strength measure is related to hypertrophy? It really comes down to time course. So there's a fantastic study that Steele, of course, was involved with by Latella and colleagues that looked at almost 7 years of data and almost 15,000 participants, where they're just doing a single set on 6 different exercises once per week to failure. It's like a HIIT personal training studio over multiple years that got looked at in multiple locations. And the average gains in strength, or I think maybe even the gains in strength that were, I think at the top end, were around 50% in the first 1 to 2 years, and they plateau. So one set to failure in a moderate repetition range is producing gains in strength that we sometimes see in 12 weeks in higher volume protocols. And then there's a plateau. And one set per week, if we take a look at your guys' analysis, is a lot less than the minimum effective dose in order to see a measurable change in hypertrophy over the typical study length that was included in your guys' study. So, like, I look at that and I go, man, that's a really bad program. You increased your strength by 50% and it plateaued in 1 to 2 years. You probably could have done, on average, a similar increase in strength with doing 4, 5, 5, 6, 10 times that amount of volume. And it's still not that unreasonable amount of volume when we look at what people do in the real world. So I think these variables are pretty well coupled, but you have to look at it in longer time courses because there's so much that goes into performance. And also, how do you determine performance? Are we looking at your total volume load across 4 sets on a given exercise in one session, or maybe 2 or 3 sessions where you train that same muscle group again? And then are we looking at an average over a block compared to the next block? Or are we just looking at a pre-post measure, which is influenced by all those things? So, for example, one of the whole, we have to go beyond what the data can tell us. We talked about how I'm using the your guys' meta-regression to inform volume suggestions for hypertrophy. For strength, I said, listen, you may only need to do, say, 5 sets of specific practice on a given lift. And that will help you get as strong as possible on that lift in the next, 8 to 12 weeks.
Using moderate loads.
But if you want to be exactly. But if you want to be a stronger lifter for your career, we probably need to be doing some additional hypertrophy work. So why don't you think about kind of that highest efficiency tier in addition to your specific work? And then we might even be changing that at different distances from your competition. If maybe we can hang out in one of the more efficient tiers of the strength training, just doing 2 to 3 singles per week on your big 3, and then doing, say, maybe 10 to 20 sets of hypertrophy work for the muscle groups that are involved there. If we're, say, 4 months out from a powerlifting meet, then as we get closer, that comes down to only 5 to 10 sets. And now we're doing 4 to 6 singles on a given lift per week. So, like, I can't use the meta-regression to say, yeah, you should be doing more sets if you want to get as strong as possible over a training career, because the meta-regression says you get no more benefit from volume after 5 sets at most. And even if we count that as fractional sets and you decide to do like a West Side program and it's a safety bar squat and it's a front squat and it's a good morning, then okay, like it's still only 10 sets, right, at most. Even if you're only doing, like, if you never do an actual squat that you're actually testing and you go full West Side. And you never go full West Side. So, like, even in that example, it's still much lower volumes that are being used in the real world by powerlifters. And I think you have to then take a step back and extrapolate between what the data can tell us. And we go, listen, when we look at something at baseline, which really baseline is telling us of all the aggregate things that happened up to that point. It's not just a single time point measurement in reality. It's what led to this study where we included a bunch of experienced powerlifters, measured the cross-sectional area and saw who was strongest. And we saw a strong correlation, and it's been replicated 3, 4, 5 times now between performance and these various indices of muscle size. Well, maybe it was the accumulation of that muscle size. Call me crazy. So, okay, if these things are related, I probably want to try to increase it over time. And that's not going to be best done by what increases strength in the short term based upon this analysis. So we've got to borrow from the hypertrophy analysis for our long-term outcomes. And then we got to think about the timing of it. And that's where that practicality that the data can't tell you must come into play. So that's my way I view the whole thing. As far as how do I use performance as a metric for hypertrophy, ultimately what it tells me is that overload is occurring. If strength and hypertrophy are related, that means that your hypertrophy at some point should be influencing your ability to produce force. I can't predict the time frame. I can't predict how much it's going to influence things relative to the fatigue and all the other factors that are going to influence performance on the day. But if we back up far enough, I bootstrap to how experienced of a person you are in the weight room, because then we're going to have more signal to noise. Like if you're able to put on much more size in a short-term period, then the relative impact of whatever it happens to be of your muscle size and performance is going to be a larger aspect of what I'm seeing, so long as we're outside of that really early newbie phase where we know there's, huge motor learning changes where you're going to double your strength in weeks, right? So that's an exaggeration, but you get my point. So for a novice person where they're growing a lot, I'm expecting to see progress occur faster in the weight room And I'm expecting that to be a little more representative of what's happening in terms of morphological changes. But once we get to the intermediate and the advanced stage, which themselves are relatively subjectively determined and individually play out, because some people, the first time they lift weights would be considered advanced in terms of the field if we were to compare them objectively on the platform or on the stage, right? If they just made them shredded, snapped their fingers, put a Speedo on them. There's some dudes who I went to high school with who probably could have won a pro card when they're 18. It just is what it is. And they were doing calisthenics for football. And I'm not happy about that, but it is what it is. So that exists. That's a thing. So that means that advanced for you or intermediate for you is a slower rate of progress. And that means we have to have more distance between seeing the relationship between these variables that change at different rates, or rather different magnitudes, I should say. If we go to Hubel and colleagues, great study, almost 600 people, first 12 weeks of training, multi-site. They were doing 18 sets not to failure of bicep curls across 2 sessions, and they looked at the entire range of responses. The average change in hypertrophy, I want to say, was somewhere in, I think it was 54% in 12 weeks, which again goes to show you how, the average change in 1RM strength on a bicep curl is 54% in just 12 weeks in Hubel and colleagues, which again shows you why you don't just do 1 set to failure, because it took 2 years to get that. But the average change in hypertrophy, I want to say, was something like 20%. So we're looking at one variable that is just easier to measure. It's a larger change. So when we're looking at the relationship between the two in the short term, correlations are going to be really noisy. So I think the answer to your question is, I think it's probably the best thing we have, but we can't be looking at it with the level of precision where we assume there is a quantitative relationship we can measure. We can't even measure it in studies with a group. Yep. So why would we assume we can measure it as a coach with one person? So in practice, what I want to see is, okay, you're a late stage intermediate. Over this next 12-week block of hypertrophy training, if our volume loads aren't going up on most of the movements, we probably need to change something, because the overload and the adaptation that's occurring should eventually show up on the bar if you're growing. And if you're not, then it won't,
Here's my last
with all else equal.
Practical question to completely contextualize what you just said, because that gives me the first half of what you're saying from a practical perspective. Let's say I have that same individual, 2 18-week periods in the first one, and let's theoretically eliminate second order effects, blah, blah, blah. There's a washout period. Perfect scenario, right? Jimmy, universe A, Jimmy, universe B. In universe A, he's performing, let's say, 8 sets per muscle group, and his slope on his volume load progression is 2 arbitrary units, let's say. And for universe B, he's performing 20 sets per muscle group, and his slope is 1 arbitrary unit over an equivalent time period. Would you then say that, regardless of what you think in concept from the meta-analytic data, that for him, that different progression of volume load is indicative of that resulting in more growth from him, absent, obviously, the real measurements? Like, ultimately, the first half of what you said is kind of what Josh and I have landed on for the most part in the hypertrophy-oriented utility of this, is that if you're able to observe evidence of overload, good. That's essentially checking the box of what you want to see. You're not actively regressing, and you're not actively seeing absolutely no change in a realistic time frame, just like you said. If you're observing overload, you're probably in a good spot. But with that, we would still rely on the evidence to say, if you can accumulate and tolerate higher volumes while still seeing that overload, that likely will lead to a faster rate of growth. Would you hold that position still in after observing kind of the difference in the volume load progression, which the reason I ask that is there are other reasons that could be progressing faster, lower volumes, less fatigue, et cetera, that would be part of that equation. So I guess I'll shut up now and let you answer.
Yeah, I think the pre-post changes is not what the only variable quantitatively I'd be curious about. I'd actually want to see the variability. Conceptually, fatigue is something that induces more noise into continuous performance. because you're coming in and out of states of fatigue as you train, right? Within session, you will see some falling off of a cliff of the number of reps and load you can do when you're doing twice as much volume, right? Between sessions, sometimes there's a longer arc of force production recovery than if you weren't doing as much volume, because as we've seen from data and in reality, you recover in a shorter amount of time if you're not beating yourself up as much, colloquially. So one of the things I would want to also know in that example you gave me, two things, is the time course, which you might have said and I might have just missed it. If it was a long time period and I'm seeing that twofold greater rate of increase in progressive overload in the 8 sets versus 20 sets, that's one of the things that I go, I actually think you're responding better to lower volume. And two, what I might think this could be a confounder, and we don't need to worry too much about the peak performance you hit, is if you're seeing much more variation and variability, but there are hints of PRs being there. But mathematically, the only way we determine a slope is we're taking an average over time, right? But I would be curious about the full range. And I would be curious about, like, are we getting glimpses of that when you're in a pretty good state, you actually crush it? Like, I'll give a personal example. I am pushing relatively high volumes right now. And I am experiencing the negative effects of that sometimes, especially when environmental shifts happen, like my sleep isn't quite as well. I feel like I'm walking on a tightrope. And when I'm pushing lower volumes in this, it's not that big of a deal if I don't have as much carbs at breakfast or if I don't get good sleep for a week. This is probably one of the first times in my training career where forgetting that I had a low carb breakfast on the same day as a leg day matters. Right. And that's my perception, obviously, that could be confounded. But I didn't even think about it until I was, well, why am I bonking on this leg day? Why are my loads falling off a cliff? And then I remembered as I tried to diagnose what could be going on. Right. Or I travel and I get hurt, something like that. It's like, and my environment changes. I changed the stress balance recovery. And now I realized that I wasn't quite on as up a sidewalk. I'm tightrope walking. Right. So another thing I just did was I took a deload for the first time in a while, and I came back, and literally the first day back, I hit a lifetime PR on incline bench press. So that's the type of thing that I observe as a coach. What I'm pushing someone really, really hard is their rate of progress can be quite flitty and sometimes suppressed. You have a bad week and a good week. But when the conditions align, whoa, where did that come from? So I would want that information as well. In the specific example you're giving, like I said, if it's that much time and there's literally a twofold difference in volume load, I would actually go, I think we're at a point where volume's working against you. And I would also expect that qualitatively, subjectively, if I had a conversation with that person,
you'd notice.
I would anticipate that they'd be saying, like, man, this 20-step protocol is wrecking me, coach.
Because you would have to imagine that if there is greater variability in performance, greater variability in strength as a result of some of the negative consequences that might come from high volumes, that is also at times going to decrease the hypertrophic stimulus of subsequent sessions to some degree.
Yeah.
As we've discussed before, we're probably not fully on board with, hey, you have to be fully recovered to benefit at all from training, but you would have to imagine that, Eric, if you're at a workload where you're regularly, and when I say regularly, maybe it's once every 3 weeks for a given session, having to drop your loads by 20+%, that's probably going to be a net. That's probably going to have a negative effect than you otherwise would.
Yeah.
So I think what Eric is getting at is I don't think he's disputing the dose response relationship for that individual, but instead, if you theoretically could measure these things perfectly, specifically the volume load changes, and there was a high degree of consistency with the workloads, and you had confidence in that observation, something else has to explain that, and probably what's explaining that is some of those indirect negative consequences.
To be very clear, like, I think about this from the perspective, I'm entirely in agreement that if we measured this on a long enough time scale and had enough sensitivity to some of these external factors that bias it, particularly when people are kind of looking at, this much less systematically than we would in a study, I think those observations on the ground get really challenging. But I think in concept, they absolutely do agree.
Yeah.
And I think if you were able to, Eric hit on the couple on the spot example, hit on the couple weaknesses of the example. I shouldn't have made the magnitudes that different, because I think that makes it less comparable to what we were seeing in practice. But you hit on all the things that I kind of think about too, is that ultimately, I think the reason I asked that question is because I think people really like to use that in a much shorter time scale to say whether I'm on the right track or not. And I think the shorter time scale that you're using it relative to your advancement, the more likely there are other things that are explaining the differences in volume load than the thing that you actually want to be explaining it. So if I'm using volume load to guide my training prescriptions in a very short term for an advanced athlete, that's probably not indicative of the actual outcome that I'm trying to optimize my training for. And it's much more likely to be indicative of the things that bias my performance. So point being, you could create a theoretical example that I just gave the softball pitch in terms of 2 times the progress that I did in reality now. But I think first and foremost, I think that's rarely ever the case. Like, I don't think it'd be that noticeable outside of these like extraneous examples where somebody just like simply can't tolerate the training. But it beckons how important it is to like take into account these other things, like evaluating your peak performance on an exercise following a deload from the, the low volume and the high volume approach. Like that gives an example of like how many factors can bias the volume load progression. So ultimately, I'm circling in on that. Yes, if a magic fairy could wave a wand and we were able to delineate the multivariate nature of performance and could, isolate the hypertrophy contribution part of that equation, that volume load would probably pretty strongly correlate to that. But in any applied example, particularly in the time scales that I think most lifters that listen to stuff like this and are interested in utilizing numbers to guide their training, usually those people are looking to intervene with that kind of stuff, right? Like you're looking to track it. You're not the, there's a couple like guys on YouTube. I think Jeffrey Verity Schofield's one that comes to mind that has like just data on this kind of stuff for like years. And that's the type of thing where I think this stuff does get useful. But I think people have much less patience with utilizing those kind of numbers. And I think that's where the volume load stuff could be a lot more indicative of the training approach that's going to lead to the most hypertrophy. But I think, again, particularly in studies and the timeframes that this kind of stuff plays out, I think that's probably a red herring to some degree.
Yeah, I think just to kind of wrap this point up, and then we can wrap up the episode. I think kind of what we're all getting at is that or at least an important practical piece for application here is that these things are quite difficult to measure with a high degree of precision in practice. I think someone that's been coaching for a while or that's been lifting for a while can notice some of these things like higher variability. That's been my experience as well, Eric. Or they can just notice when, this improvement in performance has been sustained longer than I would just expect from something like a taper, right? Those are things that you kind of start to pick up on, and I think it's just kind of the skill of training and coaching that comes with time. But I think a pretty solid recommendation or a pretty solid thing to look out for that's easy is progress occurring in the binary sense over a pretty long time period, right? I think you can definitely get lost in the weeds if you try to get really specific with the rate of progress and comparing 100%. That over time.
Which I've done many a time.
Yeah, we've been guilty of that.
That's where it comes from.
And I think ultimately, again, to use a word you used before, it's quite empowering that hopefully our framework here that we're landing on with the current data and our current thinking, it simplifies things a good amount, which is helpful. So with that, man, I wish we could keep going, but it is quite late here for us. And, usually we're doing these podcasts about 14, 15 hours earlier because we're grandpas, I guess you could say, going to bed very early. But we enjoyed the podcast. Eric, thank you for coming on. There's a lot more to discuss, but I think we covered some good ground here. So I'll kick it over to you for any final words and also anything you want to leave the listener with, whether that is related to the third editions of the books or anything else.
I just wanted to say a huge thanks for having me on. And third editions will probably be coming out. It just really depends on how much editing time we are, because I'm on a groove writing, so I'll finish them this year. But obviously, I finish a draft in Google Docs. It doesn't pop up on Amazon the next day, right? So
I'm going to write it in ChatGPT and we'll beat you to publishing it. So
You probably will. Honestly, I really do need to use some of these AI tools. But yeah. Anyway, they should be coming out probably early next year, if I had to anticipate or guess. And hopefully, I'm not making an incorrect estimation. I'm not trying to George R. R. Martin everybody, but no, honestly, really appreciate you guys having me on. I would be more than happy to come on again, because something that I've been wrapping my head around, and I actually plan on writing for Mass, is how does the dose response relationship change with advanced training age? And where I'm landing right now, and I'm planting a seed just to force you guys to have me back on, is that I think the floor lifts as you advance in training age, and that a lot of our experiences of more advanced athletes needing to do more volume is more so that athletes will not tolerate slow progress, so they are trying to offset the asymptotic curve of gains that when they become advanced by doing more and training harder, and that works to a degree. And on top of that, they do actually have to do more as a minimum effective dose, because we actually have data to support that. Like in almost every fitness adaptation, like there's a cool part of my books where I talk about what is required for elite cyclists to maintain endurance performance, and they go from like training like 11 to 14 hours per week at these really ridiculous, aerobic outputs that even decent athletes can't even hit, right? If anyone's ever seen try to run the 4 minute mile or 4 minute marathon pace, and they fall off the treadmill in like 2 minutes, right? So if you take their taper that is insufficient to maintain their gains for more than a couple weeks, where they don't do like hit interspersed with it, they're training 6 hours a week, so 40 to 70% reduction in volume, and if they maintain hit, they can hold on to their adaptations for a couple months. Even if you remove the hit, it's double the volume and the intensity to max out the endurance adaptations that are observed in sedentary older adults in response to endurance training. So, and obviously, we don't need to use a cardiovascular endurance example, but there's more research on that where you can make that kind of direct comparison. But like, yeah, we do have data on tapering in strength athletes where they might have lost a little bit of muscle, or at least for this low volume phase, and it's way more than the 1 to 2 sets to failure that is increasing strength by 54%, or the 4 sets to failure that is the minimum effective dose just in aggregate in this mixed group of trained and untrained individuals in your guys' meta regression. So I think it is quite interesting how the minimum effective dose, in my mind, must change. The minimum effective dose can only get you to a certain training status, and then whether it actually is a ceiling effect or a functional ceiling because of that asymptote, I think is probably worth discussing. And it sort of doesn't really matter, but I don't think that your minimum effective dose ever becomes this astronomical point. It doesn't make sense because you would never get there if it was in the first place. And I think it is really just this game of, in the real world, we're trying to offset these slowed gains that we're getting as advanced lifters because we're frustrated, and
Yep.
I want to place better at Worlds in 2025, not 2035, right? Yep. Exactly. So they're time-bound goals. We're trying to offset something, and it definitely feels harder to do it. So it feels like it's impossible. But it's really just that we're not willing to wait 5 years to get the same gains that would have took us 1 year previously. That's my take. So I think it's those two combined effects. It's the observations in the real world of what do I need to do to see measurable progress over a time frame I'm happy with, which is very subjective, and then this raising floor. And I'll leave the listener with that, and no rebuttal is allowed from you guys because we have to end the podcast. So therefore, I'm always right.
Zach's not going to be happy with that, but we'll let you go, sir. And we appreciate having you on. We probably got through about a third of the topics that we were going to discuss.
What an outline.
But hey, the holiday season is coming up, and even and the second editions would make a great gift for a loved one or for a friend. I've gifted the books in the past, so there's an idea for you. And Eric, we look forward to having you on again to discuss.
It would be an honor to be back on, guys.
And I think there's a lot to discuss because it's always. I'm going to shut up now. All right, we'll see everyone in the next podcast. I think this episode was a great transition as we will be discussing the strength data here soon, and we started to kind of get into how do we hold both of these to be true, or how do we interpret these for both hypertrophy goals and strength goals, given the differences in the dose response relationship? So a lot more to come on that front. And Eric, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll see you next time, everyone.
See you.